using various econometric techniques to try and break the link between, the endogeneity that exists. I'm using words that I know I shouldn't be. We don't observe someone's earnings, right? We don't observe someone's earnings in the future, and so we would worry that that people who major in a particular area might be different in some way, cause them to major in a particular area, and then we might observe the earnings, and so we're not actually getting the causal connection between the major and the earnings. Rather, we are estimating the connection between the people who tend to major in a certain area and earnings, and so you want to kind of try and distinguish between those two things. There's also a lot of research that suggests that people major, choose certain majors not because they are thinking about earnings directly, but because it's just sort of their proclivities, what they find appealing. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and connect different sources of information about what you might earn in given a different majors with college major choices. We use national data to do this. We look at some popular media. It's common in CNN, U.S. News and World Report to report, these are the top 10 hot occupations or hot majors, so we try and see whether those things seem to influence what people choose. And then we also turn to the Washington State data where we can estimate what the returns are to different majors for people who are graduating from Washington, and whether your choices depend, say, on the earnings that you observe in the state, whether your major choices depend on the earnings nationally, or whether your choices may depend on the earnings in the particular school that you're in. So we're able to sort of try and parse out the sort of the localness of information and see how the localness of information may be connected to major choices. So what are the contributions of this work? Well, one, we're not making any kind of strong rational expectations, assumptions about earnings. Rather, we're saying, how do the earnings that you've observed of majors in the past seem to affect your choices of major? And then, as I mentioned, that we're able to look at a number of different majors, and so we can hopefully tease out whether the tightness of the mapping between one's major and occupation seems to affect the choices that you make. Okay, so this is my, in case I don't make it through the whole presentation, and I'm guessing that that's a little hard in the back to read. So does the choice of major, maybe it's hard to read in the front too, I'll read it. Does the choice of major appear responsive to the earnings in related occupations? And the answer is yes, but we estimate that the relationship is pretty modest, both when we use the national data and when we use the data from Washington State. And I'll talk a little bit more about what we mean by modest here, because upon reflection, it's not clear how you should think about what is modest. Do we see that college majors with tight connections to particular occupations, that those majors, there is greater responsiveness? And the answer is yes. We do see that it looks like there's more responsiveness if you are in a major that tends to map more narrowly into particular occupations. So that makes sense. Do college majors appear responsive to some of the reports about what are the hot majors or the hot occupations? And the answer is no. We don't find any evidence at all that that's the case, which is a little bit of a puzzler. In fact, we find some kind of strange results. And then do we see that majors are more responsive to more localized information than national information? And I would say, yes, there's some somewhat weak evidence in Washington that it looks like the more localized information seems to, at least in Washington State, if you're using what are our earnings in Washington associated with different majors, people seem more responsive to that than if you're looking at the earnings associated with what you'd on a national level. right? So knowing what you earn associated with a major in Washington seems to affect your major choice more than what you might earn nationally. Okay, so how do we do this? Let me actually first set up an example. So here's an example from nursing. And what we show is the relative wages of nursing on the top. That's what this top line is. And then the share of majors in nursing. And so what you see, or at least what we hope you see from this graph, is it looks like, at least in nursing, these things track pretty closely, right? So relative nursing earnings go up, right? A couple years later, it looks like the share of majors in nursing goes up. So at least in this example, it's a kind of pattern that we would expect to see. And what we're essentially doing is we're saying, do we see this pattern across lots of different majors? One thing I would point out, and this speaks to whether or not the results that I'm going to tell you more about are modest, is that there's a fair amount of fluctuation in nursing earnings. So, you know, well, the kind of policy emphasis to get people to major in areas where they're going to do well seems to make sense. It's not entirely clear that that you want people to be super concerned about earnings, at least as informed by prior earnings, but what they observe prior majors earn, because there's a fair amount of fluctuation. So it's possible that somebody could say, hey, it looked like nursing majors are doing really, really well, you know, based on, you know, what I know about people who have recently gotten degrees in earnings. But by the time you make it into the labor market, maybe nursing is not going to be such a hot thing to have majored in. Right? So the sort of the question about what people should do, I think, is a different matter entirely that actually merits a fair amount of thought. Okay, so what do we do? Well, the first thing we do is we calculate this weighted average wage associated with each major, and we do this using some national data that maps, new national data that maps majors into different occupations. So if a lot of people from your major go into occupation X, then occupation X's wage gets a heavier weight, right? And then we look at the correlation between the share of the degrees completed in a particular discipline and the relative wages of people from that discipline in prior years, right? So we try and say, does it matter when, you know, does the share of nursing, the share of people who graduate with a nursing major, is that influenced by the wages that you observe when you're a senior in college, a junior college, sophomore in college, et cetera? And then in Washington State, we have more detailed information, so we're actually going to estimate conditional logit models of the likelihood of graduating from a particular university in a particular major, given the prior wages of people from that university and that major. We use data from the current population survey for wages, the national wages. We use degree production. We use IPEDS data to get degree production. And then this mapping that I mentioned comes from the recent data available in the American Community Survey. That's how we get the mapping from major into occupation. In Washington State, we've got data from all of the public colleges and in the state over a number of years, and so we just estimate it using that data. Okay, so what do we find? How am I doing on time? Okay. Then I'm going to spend a little time on this, which, again, I'm guessing people in the back, can people in the back see this? Oh, okay. All right, great. So, okay. But it is small. Okay, so it is small. Sorry about that. All right. So across each column, we've estimated these models in different ways. We've estimated the models using either bachelor's degree only wages in some cases. in columns 1 and 3. And then, oh, I'm sorry, that's all wages. And then columns 2 and 4 are bachelor's degree only. And then looking at wages for people who are under 30 or wages for everybody, right? So we're trying to get a sense of, like, what's the information that you are processing? Do you care about all the wages you see, whether people have a bachelor's degree or not? Do you care about people who are closer to you in age, or just everybody that you might observe in the economy? And then down the rows, we're looking at the earnings for the year after you graduate, when you graduate, when you were a senior, junior, actually I think it's senior, junior, sophomore, freshman, or before that. Right? So we're trying to see, where do you see the strongest correlations? All right, and the strongest correlation, turns out across most specifications, is in year T-3. Right? So it seems like people are responding to the wages that they might observe, learn about when they are approximately freshmen. Right? And that's true, again, no matter which wages we are looking at across which columns. And then, again, the very strongest correlation occurs when we use everybody to inform the wages, not just bachelor's degree holders, and when we don't restrict the data to people who are under 30. So it looks like that's where you get sort of the strongest response. What is the response? Because these are sort of nonsensical. The response is, that is important, is 0.014. All right, so what does 0.014 mean? 0.014 suggests that's a marginal effect, and it suggests that a 10% increase in relative wages is going to increase the share in a 10% increase in relative wages associated with a particular major is going to increase the share of people who choose that major by 0.14 percentage points, right? So I would characterize a 10% increase in relative wages as a pretty sizable increase. What does the 0.14 increase in the share of the major mean? Well, the major with the mean share of majors, I believe, is 2.07, right? So what this means is that if you had a 10% increase in relative wages, the proportion of people in the mean major would rise from 2.07% to about 2.2%. Right? So that gives you sort of a picture of what that means in terms of the magnitude of the effect. And I'll talk again a little bit more if I have time about whether that's big or small. Okay. So what sort of drives these national results? Well, we might expect, again, that the mapping of major into occupation could be a factor, right? So if it's a major that maps more narrowly into a few occupations, presumably you would be more inclined to respond to wage changes in those occupations. And we also might expect that the size of the major could have an influence, thanks. Because if you're in a major with a lot of people, presumably you may get more information about wages in that major. So we use the Index of Qualitative Variation, IQV, as a measure of this mapping, and basically all you need to know is that it ranges from 0 to 1. 0 would indicate that everyone from a particular major ended up in a particular occupation. 1 would mean that everyone from a particular major spread out evenly across all the occupations that we observe, right? And I'm going to start talking very fast because I'm running out of time. But basically, when we look at the majors where there's a tight mapping, in the upper end of the distribution, we see that there is a stronger, it looks like a stronger response. All right, so this coefficient, 0.327, is a lot bigger than the coefficient when it's not even statistically significant, when we look at majors that are very loosely mapped into occupations. So again, it looks like if there's this tighter mapping, people are more responsive. That makes sense. We didn't find much evidence that the size of majors seemed to make much difference in terms of the responsiveness. I'm going to skip over that. We found no evidence connecting a major to popular media highlighting particular majors or particular occupations. Okay, so I've mentioned these results. Let me just quickly turn to the Washington results, and I'm not even going to have time to talk about them, except to say that the magnitude of the findings from Washington State are actually pretty strikingly similar to the magnitude of the findings from the national data. It looked to us like the responsiveness was stronger in Washington if we were talking about Washington wages as opposed to wages nationally. All right, so in general, our take is, yeah, there's some evidence that students are in fact responding to wages and in terms of their choice of major. The response looks smaller than, for instance, it's actually hard to think about how to compare these different responses. We toyed with doing various things, but the magnitude of the response in absolute terms is smaller than what we see associated with tuition differentiation. Yeah. I mentioned that it's unclear what magnitude of response would be good. Again, because you ultimately care about not what did people in the past earn, but what are you going to earn? And so one of the directions that we're going to take this work is to actually look at what earnings are for people who have chosen different majors and to see whether that actually does, people are essentially making good choices in terms of their earnings. I also think that there's a sort of a trade-off between the degree to which you want people to be responding to local information. I mean, that's good if your objective is ultimately to be employed locally, but there are differences between the economy in Washington State and nationally. So to some extent, you're limiting your national your national mobility in terms of occupational choice if it's associated with a particular majors, if you're only responding to what seems like is a local labor market need. I'm out of time, aren't I? Yeah. Okay, so let me stop there.